The first time I went to a pre-screening was back in 2002, a year after Band of Brothers came out, and it was Tuck Everlasting. My dad took me to it, and I remember to this day because then I wanted to read the book afterwards. It deals with a little bit of time travel, a little bit of supernatural stuff.
I don't think I've ever heard of Tuck Everlasting.
You don't know the story? No. I won't ruin it for you, but it happened to be the same film that Glenn Howerton and Charlie Day, the Dennis and Charlie from
It's Always
Sunny, they actually met during the tryouts for that film. They did not get into it. It also, the main lead was supposed to go to Sam Winchester, Jared Padalecki.
Yeah, and he didn't end up getting it?
Well, actually he did, but he didn't want to work with his co-star because he was already working with her on Gilmore Girls. This is all going somewhere. Okay, so Tuck Everlasting, and Fool Me Once, and Boy Swallows Universe, two of the shows that we've done, all of them have some similarities. First of all, they're all based off novels, and each one of them starts with a foreshadow scene of teasing what's going to come later on in the plot, you know? Something critical. The interesting thing is Masters of Air, I listened to the book. I pulled an Audible, so I actually listened to the Audible book as opposed to reading it, and the first hour of it is pure prologue to something that happens way later on in the story, way later on in the war. And they don't do that in the TV show. It's the first time that they don't that I remember seeing a show that opted not to do what the book did and not add one.
So where
Usually
do they
do
jump
the
to?
opposite.
Where do they jump to in the first episode?
They something significant happens. I can't ruin it for you because we're not there in the show yet. But I do want to spend the first part of this podcast contrasting the book and the TV show and the narrative limitations that the TV show must have run into.
Right, because this was given a $250 million budget. It was announced back in 2013 based on the 2006 book. The show started filming as far back as 2021. It's a sister sequel series to what's considered to be one of the best shows ever made, Band of Brothers, and still it is only number 3 in terms of Google's most searched TV shows. Has Been Hotel is still at number 1, but you're saying limitations, what kind?
It's a production feat. For sure.
Yes.
They've spent a ton of money on it. I'm telling you that the limitations have to do with what would have been impossible. Masters of the Air is actually not the full title of the book. It's Masters of the Air, America's Bomber Boys Who Fought the Air War Against Nazi Germany.
Yes,
right?
ran by Donald L. Miller.
It's not about a couple dozen men, which we see in the TV show. It's not about the 8th Air Force. It's not about the 100th, which is in the 8th Air Force. The 8th Air Force, the reason they're concentrating on it so much is because it's the largest aerial striking force in the war. But more than 350,000 Americans served in it. At its peak, there were 2,800 heavy bombers, 1,400 fighter planes, 40 bombardment groups, and 15 fighter groups. So we're only looking, when we look at the 100th, at one specific bombardment group at one specific time. So the Bloody 100th, as they became known because they're notorious, thanks to the heroics of their commanders, John Egan and Gale Cleven and Rosie Rosenthal, all of that came to kind of a story of its own. And so it's kind of splitting off from the book, which is taking an overall picture of the European flying war and just looking at these few compelling guys who were out there risking their lives every single day. The staggering statistics, though, are that like in 1942 to 1943, when the planes were just starting to kick off, America was just entering the war and trying to meet up with the Royal Air Force there was only a 1 out of 5 survival rate when it came to finishing your tour of duty.
Wow.
That is how dangerous flying was at the beginning of the war for Americans. Part 1, which was about 50 to 60 minutes, actually both parts are 50 to 60 minutes, right? It introduces us to Gale Cleven, Elvis, Austin Butler.
Austin Butler, yep.
He's nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time.
He needed it. Well, no, it's funny you say that. He needed a dialect coach to make him stop sounding like Elvis.
I heard it wasn't that hard,
right? No,
I know that he'd been stuck doing it for
3 years, and then right afterwards, he ended up going into Masters of the Air, and he needed a dialect coach to stop him from sounding like him.
Elvis was too young to be in the war. Like he wasn't.
He was drafted, wasn't he?
No, I think he was too young for World War II.
Oh, for World War II, yeah.
I'm pretty sure. So he is leaving. Gale Cleven leaves his girl behind in the U.S. He arrives at Thorpe Abbott's, this tiny village in England. It's the spring of 1943. He feels like he has a sweet gig because the thing about the Air Force is that getting into it, it's a pretty prestigious affair. They have to pass aptitude tests and stress tests and physicality tests, extensive training. I think it takes like a year back in the States before they were even allowed to come out. And then the pilots, those were the cream of the crop, not the navigators, not like those. If you failed out of the pilot school, you could maybe try to be a navigator, but otherwise you're going back to the Army. But it's a special club. And so Gale Cleven's feeling pretty good about himself. The benefits of being a pilot is that you're idolized by your country. They were literally making movie after movie, trying to patriotize the whole idea of going to war and fighting for what you believe in. They got to hang out in these English farms as opposed to foxholes, which we saw in Band of Brothers, where people were literally freezing all the time because but they got to travel back every day that they weren't in the air. They just went back to England and stayed in a hotel. They ate better rations. They had fancier clothes. They made the local Brits jealous because they didn't have as fancy clothes.
And we see some of that in episode 2.
Absolutely. They're very snooty to the Americans. They get all the girls because, again, the girls like the clothes. They like how rich the Americans are and sort of how immature they are.
And I guess
they dance the jitterbug. Go ahead.
I wanted to mention that Austin Butler, or Gale Cleven in the show, he is dating Isabel May. I found it funny that Tom Hanks...
In the first scene, that's who that is?
I'm pretty sure.
I didn't even recognize her. I was waiting for her to show up.
I think it's funny because they kind of switched roles. Tom Hanks in 1883 made a cameo appearance. Here was Isabel May. At least I think that's who it was because they say her name in the credits. And so they kind of did the same thing. They both
I would keep waiting for her to arrive because her name is in the top part of the credits. I thought she was going to show up later on in the series, but if we already saw her, we already saw her. The last of the benefits is that they get to drink every night, which is what almost all of them did.
Yes.
You see John Egan doing that a lot. There's a famous story that's in Masters of the Air where this girl gets a postcard in the mail, or actually a picture of her soon-to-be husband once he gets back from the war. Mm-hmm. It has him and his friend, and she's looking at it, and she turns to, I think, her father-in-law, or soon-to-be father-in-law, and she's like, look how tired they look. And the father-in-law is like, they're drunk, Norma. So yeah, they get to drink all they want, and they get to hang out with their besties. And so John Egan and Gale Cleven are doing that for the first part of that episode. But then on the flip side, just like All Quiet on the Western Front, none of that really matters when you're not going to come home in one piece.
Right.
And the potential of that happening is like 70% you're going to be a casualty of either a prisoner of war or a mental, like PTSD casualty, or you're going to die or get injured.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because I agree with you, and I remember hearing in history, you can even see it in things like The Great Dictator or To Be or Not to Be, the sense of patriotism that these people had.
And those movies were made before they really understood even how bad the Holocaust
was. This was during World War II, like around 1942, 1943.
To Be or Not to Be was 1942. They even talk about Carol Lombard in Masters of the Air because her husband, Clark Gable, was then influenced to go into the war because she had been teasing him, basically telling him, hey, you should go do this. You're making movies about it. Why not? So he leaves MGM. He goes into the war, and he actually flies planes.
So that is very funny because it's kind of also what happened with this TV series. Steven Spielberg's dad was watching Band of Brothers one day and was like, when are you going to make a TV series about the pilots? And then Steven Spielberg was like, okay. And he did a lot of research, called up Tom Hanks. They found this book, and then they decided to adapt it, like I said, back in 2013. Mm-hmm. Talking about the soldiers, though, I think that one of the best things about Band of Brothers and also Masters of the Air is the sense of camaraderie that you get kind of with all the, like you were saying in the first episode, first part of it. You're able to see them drink, and I think that it was even John Egan who put an apple on his head, and then like they threw a dart at his, trying to get it off.
The way they describe the 100th and John Egan and Gale Cleven, or Bucky and Buck, is that they are the personality of that unit, that they really made it survivable. But then there's also Rosie Rosenthal, who we haven't met, who also plays just as big a character personality-wise. And so I keep waiting for him to show up. And he was in the prologue, so I was really hoping to get a sense of seeing him there. The biggest inaccuracy of the first 2 episodes is that there's a lack of danger. So we do see people getting severely hurt, screaming, planes getting rattled with flak. But in the first episode, I think a whole like 5 bombers or something like that.
Yeah, it was 4. It was 19 that left. 1 came back. 3 were missing. 15.
We see them go down. But the book's descriptions are revealingly and shockingly horrific. I'm just going to read a little segment here. Crew members with arms and kneecaps sheared off, eyes blown out of their sockets, torsos torn open so widely that flight surgeons could see the dead man's lungs. Flak took more than fighters. It was psychologically devastating. They would fire at the flak, and no one would question why. They understood. That's not even talking about the amount of times that I was listening to the book, and the co-pilot would look over, or the pilot would look over to the co-pilot, and their head would be missing.
Yeah.
Or they would be connected to a piece of thread. Like their neck would still have like muscle thread fibers that would be connecting their head, and that would be it. So yeah, I understand why they're not concentrating on it as much. That would be a very bleak series. But at the same time, it is a form of Hollywoodization that's worth noting. And I'm sure we're also not going to get as in-depth a look as like the venereal disease chapter that there was in the book, or the amount of hookers that there were running around. They do mention them like in offhanded ways. I think John Egan was like, he has the clap, right?
Yeah.
He mentions that in the second episode, but that's just a throwaway line that's kind of paying homage to the book.
I did want to talk about that. So Screen Rant was saying that this is the perfect TV series or war series to watch while waiting for Top Gun 3, and even David McCulloch, who wrote John Adams, told Don Miller, who worked on the Pacific, to make sure they don't Hollywoodize it. Whenever an action scene would happen in Band of Brothers, it wasn't like, oh, this is a cool action scene. It was terrifying.
But
because
Band of Brothers followed Easy Company, so it had an easier task of following just a few group of guys.
And also the actors were able to talk to the World War II veterans and get a better sense of themselves.
And all those guys have passed away since. I was so sad to hear that, but 2001 was long enough ago where like you look at all them and they passed away in that time. Some of them only a couple years later after it was made. So the authenticity, that value of Band of Brothers, you're never going to repeat it.
I know, and I understand, but this is a sequel series to it, and I'm going to have to compare it to that, even though it might be a little unfair. But you got to measure your expectations. You know that Band of Brothers, there's just not going to be something like it again, and so this has to be judged just as a form of, yes, they were able to adapt the books in certain ways. It's a production feat. Did you see those credits at the end of either episode? They ran like movie credits. Look, yes, and whenever they're in the air, it feels like that part could be shown in IMAX. I mean, the production design, the production set, everything is visually stunning about wartime aviation and what they were able to create. I'm just saying that when they were in the air, I did get a feeling that it was more Hollywood, or more like, oh, look how cool this is, even though it looked great, rather than something like Band of Brothers where it was like, this is terrifying to watch.
I think they have a really hard time doing that because you're stuck in a stationary position when you're in a plane. But the fear that you have to explain is much better symbolized in a book. It's really hard to communicate. I think they do a good job in the show showing the guy vomiting all the time, Crosby vomiting all the time, being nauseous. And I think they're doing the best they can. At the end of the first episode, Gale Cleven has realized that John Egan didn't tell him the worst.
Yes.
He didn't. So he becomes completely aware of what the cost is to this war. But they head into episode 2, knowing the truth of the situation. And Egan then gets demoted, which is kind of a promotion for him because he didn't really like his job. He was too much of like an office steward there.
Right. And
he didn't get
does that happen in the book?
So, yeah. I believe so, but it's more about later on for these guys' story. This is concentrating a lot at the beginning. John Egan then is the leader of the 100th again as far as flying, and their mission is to bomb the German U-boat pens in Norway. Crosby, the flight navigator, gets promoted as well because the person who's usually navigating gets sick, right?
Yeah.
And then they successfully are able to bomb this place and then help everybody get back safely, including Lieutenant Biddick's B-17, their bomber was damaged to a point where they had to crash land in Scotland. But that was part of the Hollywoodization of it that I was talking about because no one dies. This is almost like a milk run that they show us in episode 2. And then you see them doing the race on the bikes, and then it ends, yes, with the German bombing and them watching it and saying, yeah, we're in trouble here, but we don't get a sense of real as much danger.
That's interesting because I know that the production designs, or like the people that were really working on those air scenes, said that they made sure that every single fight that ended up like that everything was correct. They tried to stick to accuracy.
It it was a real milk run, but it was a milk run. Like, there were so many ones where people were dying left and right, where it feels like showing us that in the second episode, when we only have 9 episodes to see, kind of misleads you into thinking that the early part of the flying was the safer part, when really that was when they didn't have escort Mustangs, which are fighter pilots that could kind of intercept any sort of the German fighters coming up. That didn't happen until later on in the war. So it was actually much more dangerous to be flying in the 42, 43 years than it was later on, to be those pioneers. I will give the show a lot of credit for the small stuff that it gets right. It does go through the book and cherry pick like perfect parts.
Details.
Like, Meatball was a real dog. That someone actually stole Meatball and like stuck him into or won Meatball or something, but like they weren't supposed to have a dog in the airplane and they took it with them. And then the American immaturity both endeared and pissed off the English to a point where, and frankly, all the Europeans, the French, everybody, but eventually everybody got along because they realized they were all in a war together.
Well, they tried to show that in episode 2, but then it goes into the alleyway where one of the
describe that scene. So you've got the British people kind of acting like, hey, we're part of the Royal Air Force. We've done this for a long time. You guys should not be bombing during the regular part of the day.
During the daylight bombing raids. And I think a reason for that, they explain, is because the U.S. got new technology that allowed them better accuracy.
No, they had longer range weapons. So the B-17 allowed them what they thought that they would be able to bomb further away, and so that the Germans wouldn't attack them as much, and also they would only be able to use flak against them. Flak, I think, was shown really cool in this thing because it's hard to visualize when you're reading or hearing it, but seeing the burst-in clouds of like metal and stuff like that, and how dangerous that stuff was, because any shard of it could end up. You could understand why people would get so pissed off at that they'd start firing at it as if it was like this weird ghost entity or something. But even that part where the guy took his helmet and then like tried to cover his balls, because they are like that metal is so thin and it could go pierce through. Like some of the planes came back with 200 to 300 holes in them. Any one of them could have gone right towards your crotch.
And the British, they're trying to say you should do nighttime raids, and it basically just becomes a huge fight between the two of them before 2 of the soldiers from each side go out into the alleyway, and the U.S. just punches one, and then that ended up to solve the situation almost. They were mad at each other, but...
I mean, the thing about the British and the American conversation there was it actually hinted at something much bigger, which was that the British, the Royal Air Force, had already started just indiscriminately bombing German cities, or at least German-controlled areas, which means that they weren't doing the strategic bombing that the U.S. Was saying that it was trying to do. Now, there's been a lot of questions looking at it far off time-wise, whether or not our strategic bombing was actually that strategic, because by the end of the war, we did decimate like 61 German cities, places that were completely leveled. People, like, I think there were like millions upon millions of people who were homeless by the end of it, who died, civilians, women and children. But a lot of it has come down to accounting whether or not we were doing it on purpose or whether or not we were trying to be more specific with our bombing than the British were, as far as how fault goes and whether we should feel guilty about that. And that is a whole range discussion that really hasn't come into play here, but they do kind of talk about it as in like, maybe you shouldn't try. The British were kind of egging the Americans on, being like, maybe you shouldn't try to do the strategic bombing because you're just going to waste resources.
The series did build 81 buildings, and whenever they were doing the fight scenes, this is probably what is most known about the series, they actually had LED transmitters linked up, so it wasn't that the actors were looking at a green screen. They were seeing in real time flights going past them, so it gave them more of a genuine, authentic opinion. I thought that Austin Butler did a great job. He really surprised me.
That John Egan, the guy
I was gonna say Callum Turner.
It feels like I've seen him in a billion things before. He looks a little like Dave from Todd. What was that called? The Increasingly Poor Decisions of Todd Margaret.
He's dating Dua Lipa, the actual actor.
Good for him.
But he starred in The Boys in the Band, released last month and directed by George Clooney, which also took place in the 30s. I thought that he was a standout. I thought that Austin Butler. I never saw Elvis. I know he was nominated for Best Actor in that. He did a great job. But I was going to mention, yes, John Egan is great. And then also you have the guy from Dunkirk, and he was in Saltburn.
Harry Crosby. Wait. Actually, was he the guy who... who does he play?
Lieutenant Curtis Biddick.
Yes, Biddick was the one who crashed. Yes.
And he was in Saltburn, which was released in November. So it seems like everyone, if they're not already famous, is going to become really famous in the next couple of years, especially after being in this TV series. You also have Sawyer Spielberg, who is the son of Steven Spielberg, and Raph Law, who played Sergeant Ken Lemons, who is the son of Jude Law and Sadie Frost.
Okay.
So they kept on getting all these big people into it. But I know that you saw The Pacific. Would it be fairer to compare it to something like that? Because I know...
No, I don't think so. I think the Pacific and Band of Brothers are linked because they were on the ground and you were dealing with that type of story. The interesting thing about Masters of the Air is it only deals with the European aspect. And I had listened to a Great Courses lecture, World War II, a while back, and their argument was that the Japanese Air Corps was just so strong at the beginning that they easily had... Because their strategy was, we have to... strike fast and we have to strike now in order to win this war. Otherwise, the Americans will have time. That's why they did what they did during Pearl Harbor, because and why it was so helpful for them at the very start of the war. It seemed like they had the edge, the advantage, and there was a lot of luck that came into the Americans being able to fight against them. Like one of the stories I think was like there was a bunch of American fighters who got lost and then suddenly found themselves above the Japanese, which is a great position to be in when you're fighting, and they just were able to destroy them that way. But that story we're not going to see here. So maybe it's opening it up to the opportunity that we'll get a fourth Band of Brothers type series.
If we do, it's going to be at least another 10 years,
yeah,
I feel
see it 20 years from now. I do want to talk a little bit more about the small stuff that they got right. Okay, so pop culture-wise, because we were just talking about modern pop culture, but back then, Hollywood and sports was a big deal in the books because they made reference to, I think, Victor Fleming, director Victor Fleming, is that the Oz guy? And then also Clark Gable movies.
Yep.
And how they worked together. They're both heavily featured in the book. They did tours in Europe during the war. Frank Capra, Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart was originally not allowed to be a flyer or a fighter pilot, I don't think, in the war because he was too skinny. And then he, I think, appealed the decision, and he said, I already own a plane. I'm already an experienced pilot. You let me into this war right now.
So he was able to do it.
Yes. And so MGM released him from his contract, and he was able to go over there.
I know that movies were huge back then. Not even just World War II movies, and I was glad that they mentioned all the people that they did, but people were also just wanting kind of to escape from the reality they were in. So during that 1939 to 1945 times, I know that like the movie industry really bursted. Like box office numbers were crazy.
Sure, but some of this footage that they were taking, I think Frank Capra and Victor Fleming actually went up in them and were like taking footage of certain fights.
Of actual stuff for the films?
Yes, yeah. And by the time one of them was done with the film, the U.S. no longer needed as many Air Force people, so they didn't have to make the movie in the same way. But then they also talk about Andy Rooney, Walter Cronkite, Edward R. Murrow a lot. So I was wondering if we're going to get someone cast in those guys' positions, or if they're just going to completely omit them. The Yankees were mentioned in the second episode. I think John Egan was talking about that. The reason the Yankees are mentioned in the book is because the French resistance, those people who were trying to find anybody who had maybe escaped the Nazis or who had crash landed or something and that would get them back to the U.S., they would ask questions to those people that they found, like, who's the Yankees center fielder, to test them, to see if they were actually Nazi spies, because the Nazis would actually put spies in their own prisons to see if they could rout out anybody who was trying to escape and stuff.
Interesting.
Yeah, the realistic flak attacks, I already talked about how, like, flak can make Swiss cheese out of a plane, and some of the bombers landed with 1,000 holes in them or whatever, and people were just, like, the psychological damage. Hitler at one point was thinking, let's just cancel all the fighter planes from happening and just do flak. Extremely stupid decision to if he had actually been able to accomplish it. A lot of his military people like kind of dissuaded him from that, but it would have just worsened the PTSD that was already happening with so many of our pilots.
And talking about the planes again with the production design, the Boeings they got blueprints for, they were seeing B-17s in museums, so they based a lot of that off of
if you look at the credits, they have a whole modeling section. One of the cons, the small cons that I have, is that when they take off, it does look like it's a little tiny Hot Wheels car. But that might just be because I'm so not used to seeing fighter planes take off.
I know that the cast and crew were put through a 2-week boot camp where they were also having history lessons and testing simulations. And so, like, when you see them in the cockpit, that's how an actual cockpit for one of those planes looked.
And yeah, especially the bottom half where you have one guy with a gun in a glass, like, vulnerable position.
That was crazy to me. That was an actual
That was
thing.
the least, like, you would not want that position.
Yes, that is horrible.
He took off his gloves, though, and when he was doing that above the 10,000 feet or whatever, like, I immediately cringed because you knew everything was going to freeze at once, and if they were high enough, you could instantly just die. Yeah. So, like, yeah, there's no jokes when it comes to the freezing temperatures that are getting that are there. Getting lost, running out of fuel, all of that was sort of hinted at. There was even a scene in the book that I'm looking forward to. I don't think it's ruining too much, where things get so cold. They're so high up. They're fighting each other. There's two fighter pilots facing each other with their guns, and their guns freeze. Both the Germans and the Americans.
So
how
what
do they
fight?
do? They just wave at each other.
Wait, they decide not to
wave at each other in the sky. It reminds me of the Band of Brothers scene where you hear the music coming from the other side, or they do fireworks or something, like over Christmas. Yeah. Like there was that ceasefire for like one day. It's like we're all human. It also reminds me of For All Mankind, where I think they passed the Russians in space and they kind of just wave at them too. But yeah, that actually happened. The mix of the U.S. culture, these bombardier groups, where that you'd get like a guy from the South who had never left his town, and you get like this Brooklyn guy. I forget if it's Crosby or if it's Biddick who has the Brooklyn accent, but one of them is very New Yorky. And so they would be hanging out for the first time, and you get these kind of like strange mix and melds of them, and by the end they were all family, but at first there were no bonds.
The cast had to live for a year in the English countryside to really understand the place.
Like,
that's what I read.
Yeah, the countryside is real. They would have local people run up to them, like little kids who would get to try out the planes.
And we saw that in episode 2. One of my favorite parts was when they started to play the Band of Brothers intro song right before the people were...
I didn't even notice that.
Yeah, you didn't. I heard it. I was like, that is great. The score for this is amazing as well. But we saw kids like lighting fires right before they were about to take off into the air.
In the second episode, Egan is at the dinner table or the breakfast table, and he talks about how he wants to start writing letters. He did that in real life. He wrote long form. He didn't like doing it by typewriter because he wanted it to feel real. We don't have any of those letters to this day because he didn't like make copies of or anything, but he would send them off to everybody he lost. Mm-hmm. So
and we saw him at the very beginning pouring out his beer to the people that were lost in the first episode.
Yeah, and he does have a pencil-thin mustache in real life, but one of the things that I don't think that they cast his character particularly well for was he's only 140 pounds. I think this guy is
Callum Turner, definitely bigger.
A little bit more than that. There's some odd decisions that they chose to do. I keep on seeing in the intro, they focus heavily on an African-American Air Force unit, and really, this was a segregated, like, army back then, so that's not really dealt with in the book, and I'm more surprised that they wouldn't choose to focus on the Japanese American flight group, because that turned out to be one of the best fighter classes that they had, but again, they're not concentrating on the Pacific here, and so this felt kind of like an odd choice to divert from, but I understand that, like, if you want to do representation in the war itself, I think that was the first time when they were like, we need to have an equal proportion to what the States has. And but the thing was that they relegated a lot of African Americans to lower ranking positions. And so, yeah, they would be presented, but just not in the right way.
I think that they saw that they could get the person who's Doctor Who and from Sex Education, and they were like, you know what, let's just cast him in one of these roles somehow.
Yeah, but he's not going to be part of the 8th because, again, the 8th was segregated. It's based off Masters of the Air. It pulls from other books, though. So yes. I could tell because Harry Crosby wrote his own book. And it's called A Wing and a Prayer. And it starts with, I think, the mission from the second episode. And so it's straight up...
Well, Harry Crosby, isn't he the one narrating this series also?
He definitely narrated the second episode.
Yeah, so I think he narrates more episodes
so
of the
that
series.
Makes me think that they took from that just as much as from Masters of the Air. So maybe it's not fair to say that it's just based on that book.
My problem, I think, is also just with the characters. I felt like they were archetypes, or they were just given archetypes, or given one trait. For example, you have Austin Butler; he's the leader, fine. But then you have John Egan, and
John Egan is more of the leader than Gale Cleven is.
You would say in the second episode? Because I felt like he was just the best friend to Gale Cleven.
He's literally the leader of the group when they're up at the top. That's why Harry Crosby is so afraid when he's in his plane, because he's like, I'm in the lead.
Well, Gale Cleven is the main character, I guess is why I'm saying.
Yes, he is. He's the front on the poster.
And so I felt like a lot, just different people. Crosby, he's obviously the underdog. He needs to get his flight sickness in check. That's the one trait I got from him. We've seen him
vomit so many times in the series already.
He literally thought that he got shot in the second episode.
When that vomit fell from his helmet into the map.
I knew it was coming too. The second he was throwing up into that helmet, I was like, oh, he's going to put it on. That's going to be disgusting.
The problem I had, and this is so petty, but in the second episode, you get a funny scene where John Egan is looking around asking for someone, because he's a little drunk, to ask him to sing so he can grab the mic. And
reminds me of SNL. They used to do a clip
Clearly,
like that.
he likes to be the center of attention.
Yes.
You have Elvis right there. You got Austin Butler, who has a voice, right? And they don't use it. I hope by the end of the series we get him jumping on the microphone. I know they will.
I don't think that Austin Butler needs to be like Daveed Diggs, where if you cast him in anything, he has to sing. I think
that is in his contract.
I feel like
I must have missed that Snowfall episode. That what was the one the Snowpiercer episode where he busted out into song. Some of the CGI I already mentioned look like airplane models. What do you think Tuck Everlasting, Fool Me Once, and Boy Swallows Universe all have in common? This is the same question I asked you at the beginning. They're all based on novels, and they all have that foreshadow scene.
Yes, but so is Masters of Air, like you said. And don't we get... I was a little confused at the beginning scene of Masters of Air, because we cut from them being in the bar where everyone's talking and we're kind of learning.
Well, I think you just need to learn his backstory, like where John Egan was from. They don't actually show that too much in the book. They just say he has a wife that he's going to return to once he's done, if he survives at home.
But they just strangely cut to suddenly the wing being on fire and them having to put it out right before they land on the tarmac.
Of Cleven's coming to Germany? Is that what you're saying? Or sorry, to England?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, I thought that they showed them landing, like the full landing.
Yes, they did show them landing, but when they were landing,
and then they did a belly roll or a belly landing, right?
Yeah, but one of the wings was on fire.
The engine burst out or something.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think they were just trying to speed you through and be like, this is the main character and stuff.
I think the show is very intense and gripping, visually striking. I don't think that it's going to be able to kind of hold a candlestick to something like Band of Brothers, but I think that if you can watch this on any TV screen, bigger than computer, you're definitely going to get it. The score, the sound, I think is great. The acting, I know that some people have a problem with. I think that the acting was pretty good. I'm going to give my rating an 8.5 out of 10. What are you going to give?
I'm going to give it an 8. It's going to get darker. It has to, if it wants to approach anything like the book. Rosie Rosenthal has to appear pretty soon, because where I said John Egan, Gale Cleven were considered the personality, Rosie Rosenthal helped us win the war, is what that quote ends with. So, he is essential to this thing. Can't wait for him to pop up. If you check your expectations at the door and you realize that it's never going to be Band of Brothers, because Easy Company just doesn't exist anymore, and you just don't have that. If you had an intersplicement of all these people who are actually there, it probably would have helped. But the show itself doesn't have any critical flaws. And for that reason, 8 out of 10, that's better than the average bear. Credible adaptation to the book, which I thought was unadaptable because of how broad it is in discussing things from just the 100th to talking about the Switzerland camps where they would keep prisoners of war that was actually run by a Nazi, even though that country was supposed to be neutral. There's just stuff we will never get. They even talk about the Great Escape, because that was a bunch of pilots who ended up getting away. That whole entire movie, that Steve McQueen movie, is talked about in depth in the book. So
it has an 8.1 on IMDb, and it also has an 84% on Rotten Tomatoes, 73% critic score. But much like Echo, it will take you 5 minutes to find probably a review that matches what you think of the TV series, because The Guardian TV Insider gave the series 5 out of 5 stars.
Really? The Guardian, the British one, gave it 5 out of 5 stars.
But then Rolling Stone kind of gave it a scathing review, saying we're often left guessing as to why when someone doesn't survive, it doesn't sting that much, because we barely knew them.
But not only that, the in and out of people surviving. I'm sure there were a lot of people in the Air Force who would die that people barely knew. They wouldn't even get their names, right? Mm-hmm. It was having to deal with that every single day. And then coming home, and yes, you could get drunk, and yes, you could party it up and sleep with as many girls as you wanted to. But then you'd have to wake up knowing that could be you, and you've lost your best friends,
yes.
and whether or not today was your last day, and or if you were going to be critically injured, or if you were going to end up in a Nazi camp. Like, there's just... I would not have wished that for myself in a million years, and it just sounds like a hell of its own.
And if I didn't mention already, Don Miller, he did work on this series. They worked very closely with him.
Donald Miller,
Hanks,
the
Tom
guy
Hanks.
who created the Masters of the Air.
And Steven Spielberg, the one that David McCulloch spoke to. Okay, I think that's about it.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode. Hope you enjoyed this one. Bye.
Bye.